What exactly is a continent? Seems straightforward, doesn't it? We're taught that a continent is any particularly large landmass exposed on the Earth, which in the US and many other countries around the world entails the 7 continents of Asia, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, Europe, and North and South America, but oftentimes this doesn't add up, as the supposed continents of Asia and Europe are completely connected, yet are considered separate continents. And don't even get me started on Australia, which is considered a single island continent, yet Greenland, which is the size of Mexico, is just called an island or considered a part of North America. So by extension, Iceland, which is closer to Greenland than mainland Europe, should be considered a part of North America, but it's not. These aren't exactly geological definitions either, as the continental plate don't exactly align with the prevailing definitions either, which are tainted with historical fallacies, biases, and inconsistencies, proven by the fact that in different areas of the world, people are taught that there are a different number of continents with different borders. For instance, in much of Latin America, they're taught that the Americas are simply one continent. They are connected after all, or at least were if you don't consider the Panama Canal. Europe and Asia are considered to be the same continent in many countries, known as Eurasia, which makes sense, but again, they are considered separate for historic and cultural reasons. But using that logic to say that the Middle East is more culturally similar to other parts of Asia, rather than, say, its immediate neighbors of North Africa or Europe, I don't know, that'd certainly be a difficult argument to make. And do North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa share the same culture? Barely, although the Horn has provided the cultural and genetic bridge between the two regions. The United Nations has its own regional definitions of the world, which I would say is a bit flawed, and these are the 22 different statistical regions as defined by the UN, which are based off human geography rather than geological features. So really what we'll be defining here more or less is a mixture of geographic and cultural regions that will be contiguous and of approximately the same size. Otherwise, we could just divide these infinitely with more and more arbitrary definitions. And honestly, I think the whole notion of continents needs to be done away with altogether and replaced with a classification that can actually help in understanding the world rather than just confusing people, unless they can come up with a more standardized definition. Now, just like my map I created over different ethno-racial groups worldwide, a lot of this is just my opinion, and I'm not an expert of course, but this is my modestly informed perspective from travel and research, and I realize that the everyday vernacular used by English speakers over this subject isn't going to change anytime soon, but this is just to give you an insight into my mind. Now, Asia is cited as the largest continent in both size and population, having over 60% of the human population, and it really is mind-blowing to think that you can have the most densely populated regions on the planet, northeastern China and northern India, right next to the most desolate, that being Siberia and Tibet, respectively. As such a large continent, it feels rather odd to use in any context when describing geography or people, having extremely hot, humid regions near the equator, but completely frozen tundras nearer to the pole, and of course on the Tibetan Plateau. And when you're thinking in terms of race and ethnicities, there are a multitude of different races, with East Asia perhaps being the region with the most clear and obvious connections between its people and geography. And East Asians, such as the Chinese and Japanese, were some of the first Asian migrants, which is why in the US and Canada, when using the term Asian to describe someone's race, we are almost always referring to East Asians, although in the UK, the term Asian is more often used for those from the subcontinent. I see a lot of people claim that Asians have a common culture, which can be seen in immigrants that come to the US, and maybe to a certain extent, but really the only thing they're describing is the old school traditional customs that used to be seen in the West not too long ago, and as I mentioned, Southwest Asia, or the Middle East, has far more in common with North Africa than East Asia, which is why in King Mason's world, the Middle East would definitely be considered its own continent at the very least, and this could be divided between northern and southern regions, as the Arab countries in the south have far more in common with each other, and Turkey, Iran, and the Caucasus do share a certain affinity as well to a lesser extent. South Asia seems like an obvious division to make as well, which has similarities to all of the surrounding regions, and the UN classifies Iran and Afghanistan into South Asia as well, but I'd say that Afghanistan has more similarities with its northern neighbors in Central Asia, which would encompass pretty much all the Stan countries that gained independence following the collapse of the Soviet Union. I've seen people ask online and in person so many times whether Russia is a part of Europe or Asia or what, and honestly, Russia really is just its own thing, being culturally and geographically distinct from just about every other region on the planet, the result of Slavic expansion from the west into the Ural and Siberian regions, assimilating and replacing many of the natives in these areas. Lastly, in Southeast Asia, there are two main ways you can slice it from a human geography standpoint, that being the Austronesian inhabited archipelago in the south, referred to as Malaysia, and the northern continental half stretching from Vietnam to Myanmar, whose culture, although not homogeneous, is quite distinct from that in the south. And the entirety of Southeast Asia has both Chinese and Indian influence, although the far eastern portion is a bit closer to that of Oceania. The South Pacific, a region consisting of Australia and a whole host of smaller islands, is traditionally divided between Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, but in the current day I would define only two regions, with Australia and New Zealand making up Australasia, and the smaller islands to the north, including Papua New Guinea, making up Oceania. Moving on across the sea, Africa is a continent that actually somewhat makes sense, only the differences with the northern portion are so stark, some have even claimed that it might as well be its own continent, but we'll count it as its own unique region consisting of Egypt, the Maghreb, and Sudan. Going down to sub-Saharan Africa, I would agree with most of the UN definitions on this, except I would definitely divide the region of East Africa, as the Horn is insanely divergent from Kenya or South Sudan in terms of people and locales, and we would also be dividing the southernmost third, including Madagascar and the Mascarene Islands, although really they are just their own thing. When it comes to Europe, generally the continent is split in two between eastern and western halves, which is mostly due to Cold War classifications, as the Iron Curtain really did a lot to solidify the differences between the two, and the UN breaks it down into Eastern, Northern, Western, and Southern Europe. Rather curious to include Romania and Hungary with Eastern Europe, but exclude the former Yugoslav countries, and also rather odd to include the Baltic states with Scandinavia and the British Isles, as well as grouping together Spain and Greece, two countries that, other than their climate, have very little in common. I would really only divide into three regions, that being Western, Eastern, and the Balkans, with Eastern Europe including the Baltic and Slavic countries west of Russia, and I know the inclusion of Finland in Western Europe is sketchy to say the least, but due to centuries of Nordic rule and influence, Finland is highly modernized and heavily politically and culturally integrated with the West. The Balkans, though heavily divided from an ethno-linguistic and religious perspective, certainly share much in the way of culture and genetics, as arguably the Yugoslavs of the present day have more in common with the neighboring Hungarians or Romanians due to their proximity, trade, and migration. Excluding Australia and the Pacific, these previous regions of Europe, Africa, and Asia are generally referred to as the Old World, that meaning the world known to the people in Europe and Asia before the age of exploration and expansion of European empires to Oceania and the Americas, which is referred to as the New World. And although normally divided between North and South, anyone could tell you that a country like Panama or Cuba that is technically in North America obviously has much more in common with their Latino cousins in South America than the Anglos in the North. Therefore, the southern U.S. border is generally what defines the marker between Anglo and Latin America, although the large French and Spanish-descended populations in Canada and the U.S. do complicate this a bit, a topic I'll leave for another time. And Brazil, although similar, is still quite distinct from other Latinos of the Americas. Describing something as North American really does almost nothing to dictate who or what you're talking about, since the continent is so diverse. So I, along with many others, prefer to use the term Northern America when specifically talking about the United States, Canada, and maybe Greenland. I mean, why not? They don't really fit anywhere else. Although some people just use North America synonymously with Northern America anyways. As for the Latino and Caribbean countries of North America, some people mistakenly use the term Central America when referring to this entire grouping, when the more accurate term is Middle America, as strange as that sounds, as Central America actually refers to this smaller collection of nations in between Mexico and Colombia, and sometimes includes parts of the southern states that were formerly a part of the Federal Republic of Central America. We could also divide between the mainland and the Caribbean, as some of the English-speaking Afro-Caribbean countries are quite distinct from Mexico or other Hispanic countries, and there is a bit of a regional Caribbean culture from Cuba to Trinidad, despite the differences in race, religion, and language. As for South America, it makes the most sense to divide with the Spanish-speaking countries in the west, from Venezuela to Argentina, and include Brazil and the Guyanas in the east, although there is also an argument to be made for the shared heritage of the Southern Cone, defined as Southern Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile, and this is exemplified by having the highest European component in Latin America, with a large population of Italian, German, French, or Slavic heritage, in addition to Spanish and Portuguese. So, even though I attempted to divide roughly evenly by population and area, some regions will still be highly disparate, with the largest region by population being South Asia, followed by East Asia, both well over 1 billion, with the smallest being Australasia and Oceania, while the largest in terms of land area would be Russia and Northern America. Also, Antarctica is at the bottom as my 25th region, but hardly anyone lives there, so we can't really do much. I probably won't be changing the way I or anyone else speaks, but I hope this has given you insight into how I view different countries in relation to each other in the world, and even then, once you learn the differences between certain countries, it becomes extremely hard to confuse them with each other, which is especially true for the regions of the Earth, as they all have incredibly different cultures, languages, climates, and histories. Let me know your thoughts on the current classification scheme for various continents and regions and how you would redraw the continents. And for today's poll, let me know what method you tend to think of the world in terms of human geography. And as always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.